you mentioned that there are so many pieces of the puzzle falling into place. And I'm curious I want to unpack a bit more on what you mean. What are those pieces of the puzzle that are falling into place? More specifically.
Oh, okay. So some years ago, I began explaining this. I pointed out that the various major interventions of the United States in the Middle East were perfectly consistent with the hypothesis that the United States was helping Iran to be in a better position to destroy Israel. Now, why do I say this? Because the United States has developed a very good relationship with the Lebanese government, which is controlled by Hezbollah. Lebanon is basically Hezbollah. And the U.S. has been collaborating with the Lebanese army, which is controlled by Hezbollah. And they've been sending them weapons. These are U.S. weapons for Hezbollah. The U.S. has also been developing an intimate relationship with Qatar. Qatar is a jihadi state, major sponsor of jihadi terrorist groups around the world. And major sponsor of Hamas in particular. And yet, it is impossible for the U.S.-Qatari alliance to be more intimate. The United States has its most important military base in the Middle East in Qatar. And the U.S. is the guarantor of Qatari security because Qatar is impossible to defend. It's just a tiny, tiny, tiny little peninsula of sand in the Persian Gulf. There's just no way to defend it. And it is very appetizing to bigger powers because it has some of the biggest reserves of gas in the entire world, right? So there's no way Qatar can exist without the U.S., which means that the U.S. government is in a unique position to influence Qatari foreign policy. But what is Qatari foreign policy? They are one of the main financiers of Hamas. So Qatari foreign policy is the destruction of Israel. The U.S. bosses give every appearance in their relationship with Qatar to be very happy with that policy, which is also the case when you study their relationship to Lebanon, to the official Lebanese government. Then look at the policies that were very costly. That the bill came in at billions and billions of dollars, which is the Gulf War and then the invasion of Iraq. The consequence of those gigantic interventions was that Iraq was completely destroyed. And when Iraq was destroyed, two things happened. Iraq became a nursery, a very, very, very fertile nursery for jihadi terrorism, which it wasn't before. With Saddam Hussein, Iraq was perhaps a bad place, or not the best place in the world, I'm sure, because Saddam Hussein was a dictator and he could be brutal on dissidents and so forth. But Iraq under Saddam Hussein was not this cauldron of jihadi terrorism where everybody had to fear for their lives. That was not happening. It was a relatively peaceful country. The U.S. intervention turned it into this machine to produce jihadi terrorism and export it elsewhere. That was the consequences of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. The other major consequence of the U.S. invasion of Iraq was that Iraq ended up under Iranian control. Okay? Iran ended up controlling Iraq. It still controls it. Now, Iran already controlled Syria and Lebanon. Okay? It has a very tight alliance for a long time with the Assad family that runs Syria, and it controls Lebanon through Hezbollah. So Iraq was the only thing standing between Iran and the borders of Israel, you see. And when the U.S. invasion of Iraq destroyed Iraq, and Iran ended up inheriting Iraq, it also inherited a land corridor to the border of Israel. Now, I predicted this would happen. Many years ago, I said, I can see that U.S. foreign policy is going to result in Iran having a land corridor all the way to the border of Israel. Now, that's not the kind of thing that an ally of Israel would do, but it is the kind of thing that a hypocritical pretend ally of Israel that in reality wants to destroy Israel would do. Right? And now, so when I say that the pieces are falling into place, what I'm saying is that the things I predicted all those years ago have now matured. We now have a situation where Iran has a land corridor all the way to Israel. They're supplying Hezbollah through land. They're sending Hezbollah weapons, making it stronger. Hezbollah is now very, very strong, according to every report I have read. They have a gigantic army and a lot of hardware, right? This is thanks to U.S. policy. And remember, many of the weapons that had been weapons of the Iraqi army ended up in the hands of ISIS, right? Those are American weapons. So there is a Machiavellian interpretation that says everything came out as it was intended. None of this was a mistake. The way to explain it is to say they are trying to destroy Israel, right? So you have two alternative worldviews. One that says everything U.S. bosses did in the Middle East was a series of tremendous mistakes because they have the best interests of Israel at heart and are trying to protect Israeli security. It's just that they're incredibly stupid, mostly ignorant about the Middle East. You know, this is a narrative we hear in the media all the time. And so they find it very difficult to think about what the consequences of their actions in the Middle East will be because they're so naive and stupid and ignorant. So that's one hypothesis. And what we've seen over the past half century is just a long string of what many analysts believe are obvious mistakes, right? The other way to think about this is, no. You just got their values wrong. Now, why might the reason it is attractive to consider that second hypothesis is that the first hypothesis is asking you to believe something that is very implausible. It is asking you to believe that the most powerful people in the world, and I would say the most powerful people in history, because nobody has been able to mobilize as much power as the government of the United States ever in history, right? So the most powerful people in history are just complete idiots. And every time they invest billions of dollars in the Middle East, things come out exactly the opposite to what they intended. I think that's unlikely to be true. I think that the most powerful people in the world are probably pretty smart. Why are they so powerful if they're idiots? You know, so they're probably very smart. I mean, after all, they have gigantic bureaucracies that are capturing information all the time, yottabytes of information, and they're categorizing this information. They have teams analyzing it, pushing it up the hierarchy to have the most rational decision-making process possible because they're playing for world power. I mean, when you're playing for world power, it is unlikely that you will do things superficially or on a whim or without proper analysis, or that if you're ignorant about the Middle East, you won't rush to correct that with experts who do know about the Middle East. After all, you have all the money. You can just buy the expertise you need. Why wouldn't you do that, right? So it's really quite implausible that the most powerful people in the world are as stupid as the media and academia would have us believe when they routinely explain what has happened in the Middle East for the last half century as a series of endless mistakes. The other thing that's weird about the they make mistakes hypothesis is that these mistakes seem all to go in the exact same direction. So the mistakes always make Iran stronger. And, stupidity, you don't expect that kind of consistency from simple stupidity. Stupidity, is more random. If you're just making mistakes, why would the mistakes always go in the same direction and achieve qualitatively the same result, which is to make Iran stronger? That's very strange. The probability of that is very low. So I think we should consider the Machiavellian hypothesis that says that everything that U.S. bosses have been doing in the Middle East, which has been progressively weakening the security of the Israeli state, is precisely what they intend. And as you mentioned, some of the things that have happened very recently are so dramatic that some people are suddenly saying, oh, this is new. The U.S. seems to be against Israel. What's going on? No. You just weren't paying that much attention before. And some of the behaviors weren't as dramatic as these. And the media was careful to give you an interpretation that before October 7th, when you weren't so scared and you weren't paying this much attention, were sufficient to keep you more or less asleep. But now that's harder because after October 7th, anything less than full support for Israeli retaliation becomes obviously a kind of betrayal of what the relationship between the United States and Israel was supposed to be. So a lot of people are kind of waking up to this situation now. But the structure was always the same. It's just that people were not paying attention.